In this video, I'm going to talk about raising. Raising essentially is when you take a flat sheet of metal, typically a disc, and through many rounds of hammering, you bring that disc up into a volume. So typically you're going to start with a flat disc. You'll do an initial round of sinking. Sinking is when you hammer that disc down into a depression. Sinking stretches the metal, so you can only do sinking once or twice. From there, you're going to start raising this. You're going to start working over a form to push that metal and start to give it volume. So you can see through many different rounds. A round is when you hammer the metal completely and then go in a kneel. Through many different rounds of hammering, that form just starts to grow, okay? And that volume just gets deeper and deeper and deeper. With raising, basically we're making a synclastic form, all right? So a synclastic form is when your x-axis and your y-axis are essentially going in the same direction. If you think of it like a volume. In our next video, I'm going to show you how to do an anticlastic form, and that's where your x-axis and your y-axis go in different directions. You want to think of that kind of like a saddle or Pringles potato chip. Okay, so I have my disc of metal. This is a little bit smaller than what I recommend that you use. I recommend you use either an 8 to 10 inch disc to start with. Anything bigger than 10 inches, you're going to have a lot of metal to move. And anything smaller than like 8 or so, it's just, you're going to end up with a really tight, small form. This is about 7.5 because that's how big the piece of metal was that I was working with. So I used these shears to cut it. I started actually using the Beverly shear next door, but it was leaving one heck of a burr. And so these are brand new Aviator shears, and they did an excellent job, but I still have a bit of a burr. So one of the first things that I'm going to do is use a file to file that away. I prefer to come to an edge of the table. That way I can hold my metal right on that edge and just file that burr away. You really want to get rid of this burr because you're going to be holding on to this piece of metal really tightly. And if you have that sharp chunk of metal on there, you know, it could really start to cut into your hand. So do a decent job getting rid of that burr, and it'll make your life a lot easier. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out my reference lines. I need a number of concentric circles. That way when I'm hammering from the outside, I'm going to stay in a nice even pattern. In order to get those concentric circles, I'm going to start by using a pair of dividers. I already have a center line marked. You probably can't see it on the camera, but I can see this teeny tiny little divot there. So I'm going to start Okay, I'm going to open it up a bit. And then maybe one more. Now I like to trace over those with a Sharpie. That way I can see them a lot better. Now these don't have to be perfect. They're just a bit of a guide to keep your hammer blows on track. All right, so now I'm ready to do the first move, which is going to be sinking. So I'm going to take a minute here to talk about all the different hammers that we're going to end up using for raising. The most common hammer that I use is this one. This is our standard raising hammer. It has a large oval shaped face on one side and then a tighter oval shaped face on the other. The tighter face is actually going to move the metal a little bit quicker, so I will typically use the tighter face for raising, and then I'll use the larger face for sinking. In addition to this style raising hammer, we also have these raising hammers. Now they're not as oval shaped, they're more of a cross peen face, but these will raise metal just as well. This hammer is a little bit lighter than that previous one, and it's going to move the metal just a little bit differently. In addition to the raising hammers, we have these large sinking hammers, okay? So I consider this to be a sinking hammer. It basically is a large round face, almost like a giant ball peen, and they're very deep, right? And so you can really get down deep inside your work. This is also a sinking hammer or embossing hammer, okay? We have a wider face and then a tighter face. And then we also have some really small embossing hammers. In addition to the raising hammers, a hammer that you're going to use often is going to be one of our mallets, okay? We're going to use the mallets for bouging, and you'll learn what that is in just a minute. Bouging is when we basically hit the irregularities along the edge of that, kind of hit them flat. In addition to the raising hammer, one of the most common hammers that you're going to end up using is the planishing hammer. Now, it's really important on all the hammers that you choose to use that you make sure the faces should be completely blemish-free, especially with the planishing hammer, because the planishing hammer is going to be one that you use to finish your metal. And if there is a scratch or a dent or a mark on this hammer, or even corrosion, you're going to be hammering probably hundreds of thousands of hammer blows on your piece of metal. And if there's a dent in this hammer, it's going to get transferred to every single mark. And so you're going to have to completely go back over it because there's no way to get rid of those. So I usually take a minute. If there's any surface corrosion or anything like that, I'll polish that off, and then I can go ahead and get started. Below the hammers, we have all of our large forming stakes. Most of these are considered to be a tongue stake, okay, because it kind of looks like a tongue. And we're going to do most of our work on this curved surface here. The bigger the stake, the more energy is going to be transferred into your metal. The smaller the stake, the more it has a tendency to flex, and you lose a little bit of energy, right? So for our major forming, typically I start with this huge one, the Cranbrook stake, and do most of my work on that. So in addition to the large forming stakes, we have all of these mushroom stakes. Now typically the mushroom stakes are going to be used for finishing, right? Mostly planishing metal. And these will typically go in a stake holder and not be held by a vise. We also have these very small stakes, and we have various holders for these as well. Okay, and there's a large holder over there. So I'm going to get started by sinking this piece of metal. We have this really great stump that has a sinking depression in it. It's relatively small, but it still works. I want to make sure that my reference lines are on the bottom. Okay, I want to make sure those reference lines end up on the outside of the form, not the inside. So for sinking, I'm going to use the fat side of my raising hammer And with sinking, you start from the edge and you work your way towards the middle in concentric circles. I want to try to get those hammer blows as close to one another as possible. Of course, I failed to mention, you want to make sure you're wearing ear protection when you're doing this. This is a very loud operation, and you don't want to damage your ears. So I've gone one whole rotation, and you can see how much volume I'm getting already. Move in just a little bit. Now, anytime you get little wrinkles like that, you want to hammer them out. Now you can hear the pitch of the metal start to change as we get closer to the center. That's because that metal is stretching and getting harder as we work. You can't sink a piece of metal too many times because this will stretch too much and then you just won't have any material left. It'll just break and crack. Okay, so here is my sunk form. What I need to do now is I need to take this upstairs and I need to anneal this. Another option for sinking is to use one of these sandbags. Okay, sometimes they're full of sand. Sometimes people will fill these with lead shot. What's really important though when you're using the sandbag is make sure the edge of the metal doesn't cut into that bag, okay? These theoretically should last forever, but you can see if you look close, there are some little, almost little cuts in there. So we really need to take care of these things and make them last. So to sink on the sandbag, just like before on the stump where I started on the edge, I'm working my way towards the center. See how that metal starts to come up? Now, this is a fairly large piece of metal. This was a 12-inch disc. And one of the things that tends to happen when you're working on a large piece of metal, you see how I start to get this almost taco shape. So an easy way to fix that is to step on it. And by pressing the high parts down, it actually brings the lower parts back up. Now with sinking, I actually don't even really have to use anything. I can do sinking moves right on a flat surface if I hold my metal at an angle. So if I work like this, I can continue. Once again, I'm holding it at an angle and I'm hitting the metal to the surface of the butcher block. I'm not hitting it directly against it. I would continue all the way until I reach the center of this, and then I would anneal like anything else. So the most efficient way to anneal this piece of metal is to actually take it outside and use our big weed burner torch. It's really cold outside today, so I'm not gonna do that. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna use 2 of our natural gas torches. You want nice big bushy flames. And heating the copper from the inside of the form will help radiate heat all around that form. Just helps it heat up a little bit better. So I'm looking for the color change and that hesitation where the clean oxidized mark is. Obviously not getting this hot enough that it's glowing red. In an ideal situation, we would be able to turn the lights off and you would see this dull glow, but we don't have that ability in the metalsmithing studio. Next thing I need to do is I need to quench, and I need to quench the whole thing evenly. You can see those Sharpie marker lines are still there. So one of the most important tools that you will need to make is a template, okay? You need the negative of the template and you need the positive of the template. The negative of the template is handy because it tells you where on the tool to work. So if I chose this tongue stake, I can take my template and I can hold it on the stake to tell me where to work. Okay, you could just line it up. So sometimes you're holding your metal at a very steep angle, sometimes it's very shallow, depending on what you're doing. And subsequently, I can take the positive of the template and I can hold it in my form. And that tells me the same thing. It tells me where on the form I need to work. And so in the case of this template is in contact. This template is in contact with the form until about there. At this point, that form, the metal form that I'm working on, starts to separate from the template. So I know as a reference point, I don't need to hammer this bottom quarter of the piece anymore. I'm gonna do my next rounds on this particular piece of metal right about here, okay? Now to put the vise in the stake, it can be a little cumbersome. So I'm gonna put it right there to rest first, and then I'm gonna kind of use my stomach and hold this up this way as I tighten down. I'm gonna get it as tight as I can with my hands, but I don't trust that. Okay, so what I'm going to do, I'm going to use a large hammer that we can use on steel. I'm just going to give this a couple hits to tighten that up. When you're working, so this The jaws of the vise should never come in contact with the working area of the stake. When you look at the stakes, every single stake has an area right here that connects, that the vise should hold. The T part of the stake rests against the bottom of the vise where the threads are. That way it's not going to change its position. I can change the position of this stake to my liking. Okay, I can pitch it up, I can pitch it down. It's all going to give me better access to the end of that stake. This is the area where I'm going to be working. I want this to be at a comfortable position for me to work. If I'm having trouble holding this on the curve, I can just pitch this up. I may need to get a platform to stand on. You don't want to hammer too high. If you're hammering too high, you're gonna choke your elbows up, and you're gonna do more work with your wrist than with your elbow. I have my sunk piece of 18 gauge copper. You see my reference lines have been redrawn. I am basically going to start on the outside of this first ring. My template has a gentle curve at the bottom. So I don't want to start all the way in the center, because that would give me more of a cone shape, more of a point. Hold the metal very firmly. I'm holding the metal with the palm of my hand, and my fingers are very firmly holding the other side. Hold your hammer at the base of the handle. Okay, don't choke way up and hold it like this. I'm going to start using the smaller side. You can tell where you've hit because that metal is shiny. I want to get those hammer blows as close to one another as possible. I don't want to see any pink space in between. And it's kind of hard to see on the camera, but if I allowed that gap in the hammer blows to continue, I would end up with a crease of soft metal, because the way raising works is I'm basically hitting the soft metal into the hard metal. I'm using the fact that this metal, where it's shiny, has been work hardened. It's more secure. It doesn't want to move like the rest of the metal will. Now we should see this little lip, and basically what I'm doing is I'm chasing this lip all the way up to the edge of my metal. Okay, I had to slightly readjust because it was getting difficult for me to stay on the curve. adjusted the position here in the hopes that you can see how I'm working. You want to be working and moving your elbow, okay? Tired muscles are okay. Sore joints are a problem, okay? So pay attention to your body. Also, when I'm standing just off to the side of the stake. I want to imagine a straight line coming from this stake to my arm. The hand that's holding the work comes across my body. Okay, I don't want the hand that is doing the work to come across my body because the hammer position changes. See how the face of that hammer now is cocked at an angle? When I'm straight, I can hit straight. Now as you work, when you start getting up close to the edge, you're going to notice some waving, some fluting that's happening. That's good, okay? I want nice, calm, even waves. What I don't want is a sharp crease, because that sharp crease could end up being a crack later. As I start to get up to the edge, my hammer position changes a little bit. Instead of using this small side, I'm going to turn around and use the larger face. I'm also going to avoid hitting all the way up to the very edge of this piece of metal because I don't want to smash that piece of metal. Sometimes you have a pretty big dent that you need to hammer back out. Just come over to the table, to the stump, to the sandbag. You just tap that right out, get that metal back into position where it needs to be. Now I've just raised this piece up into a pretty significant volume in a very short amount of time. I really need to preface that this is one of the things that I am good at, right? So I make this look easy. I would assume that it's gonna take you a good week or so to get to this point, okay? Some people get this very quickly. Others, it takes a little while. Give yourself the opportunity to learn this technique. Basically, this is my first round of raising. I can see that pretty much the entire surface of this piece of metal is shiny. So I'm going to go and I'm going to anneal it. And basically, I'm just going to repeat this process over and over and over again until I start to get to the volume that I'm looking for. So you may notice some irregularities along the edge of this. That's natural. That just comes from how you hold it, how you hit, how you rotate. So periodically you want to do a move that's called bouging. Bouging involves the use of a flat face mallet. You can do bouging on something or you can do bouging on a flat surface. I'm going to show you bouging on this bowling ball first. This is hardened metal. I've just done a complete round of hammer forming on this. I have not annealed this yet. And I'm just going to work around just on the edge of this piece of metal. Until the entire thing is in contact with the bowling ball. Now, you don't need to do that a ton of times. We also don't want to flatten this out. I don't want to flare this out. So just nice light hits on the edge. I can do my bouging on this flat surface if I want to. Basically, I'm going to allow just a teeny bit of the form to overhang the edge of that piece, at the edge of this butcher block. And what you'll notice is there's some high points and some low points. You're basically hitting the form until, just like on the bowling ball, until it touches the whole way around. See how these nice big waves start to turn into smaller and smaller and smaller waves? Periodically, between rounds, you want to do a move that's called edge upsetting. Basically, this edge is kind of a weak point as you're working. And so, just like when you're throwing in ceramics, a lot of times you'll compress that clay at the very edge, and you want to do the same thing with your metal. So, you're just basically going to use a cross peen hammer. I have two of them here. This is our larger cross peen, and this is our smaller goldsmith's hammer. It doesn't really matter what hammer you use as long as it's a cross peen. And before I anneal, while this metal is still hard, I'm just gonna, I just basically hold this in my lap, and I'm gonna and I'm basically just working along this edge, thickening up that edge ever so slightly. You don't have to do this a whole bunch of times. Like maybe every 5 rounds, a round being time between anneals, maybe every 5 rounds or so. It's not something that you have to keep doing over and over and over again. So once my form is done, once I've gotten this piece of metal formed to the profile that I'm looking for, I need to planish. If you look at the surface, you can see a lot of marks from the raising hammer. It's not that attractive of a surface, and it's also very irregular. So what I need to do is, with a planishing hammer, I'm going to work over a mushroom stake. Now you want to find a mushroom stake that is nice and clean, because any mark, just like in the planishing hammer, any mark that's on this surface is going to get transferred into your metal. Chances are you'll notice as you're working, there's marks being transferred from the raising stakes because they're a little beat up. And so you'll see that those marks are transferred to the inside. The same thing's going to happen with the mushroom stakes. So for instance, if I was using this one, I might take a minute and polish this. There's a little bit of corrosion on here, and I do see a few minor little dents. This is another case where your template is going to come in handy, because with the template, once again, I can hold the stake up and find where on my piece that stake is going to fit. We have a lot of different stakes and a lot of different profiles to work on. And so you want to make sure that you're getting the right one. You don't want the stake to be too shallow in comparison to your piece, because then you'll collapse it. If anything, you want it to be a little bit narrower so it fits in there. This one will fit in there just fine. So the stakes just fit into these stake holders, and this is where you want direct metal on metal contact. I'm going to start with the curved face of the planishing hammer. The planishing hammer has two faces. There's a curved face and a flat face. I'm going to start by using the curved face. Now, a lot of times people have trouble finding the stake. And so a way to find the stake is to hold the hammer directly on it, and it'll sit that metal right down onto the stake. You want to be really careful with the planishing hammer that you don't come down onto the edge of the face of that hammer, because you'll leave a really big crescent moon shaped dent in your metal that's really difficult to get rid of. So I'm going to hold the hammer firmly, and I tend to work in little patches. You notice that there aren't any concentric circles on this particular piece of metal. You don't really need them for planishing. So you could see the shiny metal, okay? What I'm doing is I'm looking really closely to make sure I don't see any of the pale pink unhardened metal in here. I'm gonna look on the inside too to make sure that I'm getting complete uniform coverage. Now I would go ahead and I would planish around this whole entire piece of metal. You want to watch, since this is so much tighter than this particular piece of metal, you want to really be moving your piece around a lot. You don't want to hold it in one spot and form the metal to the stake. Also, when I'm looking at this, I'm always looking at the outer profile, okay? If I'm standing here, my eye isn't looking at this part, my eye is looking over here at the edge, just to make sure that I'm getting the profile that I want. So that's the basic gist of raising, of taking a form and bringing it up to a volume. There is so much more that you can do with this process, but a lot of it is kind of, self-discovery, right? You have to experiment with the process. You have to experiment with different tools, different forms, that sort of thing. You can take forms and you can completely collapse them in on themselves. You can identify different areas of the form. And a way to do that is to treat these as individual forms. So you see how I've mapped out concentric circles for each of these raised bumpy areas. And the more that I do this, the more that they'll start to come up off the surface. A lot like that image, that very first image in the PowerPoint by David Pimentel. So you can raise to the center, okay? And if you raise to the center, you'll end up pushing that lip of metal, and then you'll have an excess amount of metal at the center, and that's a way to get a really nice sharp point on the end of your piece. You never want to put your metal over something pointy because you'll just blow a hole out in the back. And so play around with the process. We can flute edges, right? It's just a matter of how you're holding that on the tool. You just get in there with a, kind of cross peen on the tool and hold it up at an angle and just kind of hammer that out. So there's all different types of things that you can do, but you're going to be spending a lot of time with that initial raising activity, just pushing that material up into a volume. It's really important to be patient with the process. Okay, like I said earlier, I consider myself to be very proficient at this process. I have a habit of making things look easy. This is going to take a while for you to be able to hammer that stuff up into a volume. So just be patient with it and keep working and you'll do great.